a bright red cape, a basket of wine and cake, a wolf with big eyes, big ears, and big teeth. But the tale you were told as a child is a lie, a sanitized, surgical reconstruction of something far older and far darker. The truth is that Little Red Riding Hood isn't just a nursery rhyme about obeying your parents. What we are actually looking at is a 3,000-year-old survival guide that has mutated alongside human civilization. Like a virus adapting to a new host, this story has rewritten itself across millennia to encode the specific nightmares of each generation. From the frozen, starless forests of the Iron Age to the decadent courts of 17th century France, each era has stripped away the previous flesh of the story and grafted on its own terrors. If you know how to read the layers, you don't just see a fairy tale, you see a history of human predation. The story begins as a warning about literal hunger and wild beasts, transforms into a medieval paranoia about shapeshifters and witches, and finally evolves into a Victorian lesson on sexual morality. But to understand the true horror of the original message, we have to forget the version we know. Because in the beginning, there was no woodcutter, there was no rescue, and the wolf wasn't just an animal, he was a test. To see the story's true face, we must travel back to the very first layer, to a time when the woods weren't a metaphor for getting lost, but a guarantee of being eaten. Travel back 3,000 years to the very first layer of this story. You are in a peasant settlement on the edge of the Black Forest, or perhaps in the high valleys of the Loire. The timeline is hazy, it is the Iron Age, or perhaps the early Dark Ages, but the atmosphere is distinct. The walls of your home are wattle and daub, the roof is thatched, and the world outside your door is not a playground. It is a hostile, terrifying expanse. In this era, the forest was not a place of recreation. It was the boundary of human existence. To step beyond the tree line was to enter a domain where you were no longer at the top of the food chain, and in the center of that darkness was the wolf, not the anthropomorphized, talking cartoon of modern cinema, but the apex predator that competed directly with humanity for survival. Wolves killed the livestock that kept the village alive. In harsh winters, they dug up fresh graves. And yes, they took children who wandered too far from the hearth. This is the soil in which the story grew. An old woman is telling a tale by the fire, but she isn't reading from a book. She is reciting a warning, passed down orally, stripped of all sentimentality. In this original oral tradition, variants of which were later catalogued as the story of grandmother, there is no Red Riding Hood. The girl has no name, and she has no red cape. Those symbols belong to a future world of textile wealth and color symbolism. Here, she is simply the peasant girl. The story begins with a task. Her mother sends her to her grandmother's house, not with wine and cake, but with a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk, basic, life-sustaining staples. The journey is the first test. When she reaches the crossroads, she meets a bzoo. In the folklore of the time, this wasn't quite a wolf, and not quite a man. It was a werewolf, a shapeshifter, a creature that walked the liminal space between the village and the wild. The bzoo asks her, "Which path will you take? The path of needles or the path of pins?" This is a detail that was surgically removed from later versions, but for the Iron Age listener, it was rich with meaning. The path of pins and needles represents the destiny of women in agrarian society. Needles represent the labor of the seamstress, the domestic life, the drudgery of the interior. Pins represent the fasteners of finery, the preparation for adulthood, or perhaps the prickly, dangerous route of the wild. The girl, showing a spark of independence that will define this layer, chooses the longer, scenic route, the path of pins. She gathers hazelnuts. She chases butterflies. She is acting like a child in a world that does not tolerate childhood. While she plays, the bzoo rushes to the grandmother's cottage. And here, the story takes a turn so dark that it reveals the true brutality of the era. There is no closet. There is no hiding. The beast kills the grandmother, but he doesn't just swallow her whole. He butchers her. He pours her blood into a bottle on the shelf, and he puts her flesh in the pantry. Then, he gets into the bed. When the girl arrives, the scene is not one of suspicion, but of gruesome intimacy. The creature, disguised in the shadows of the unlit cottage, invites her in. She says she is hungry after her walk. The creature tells her to look in the pantry. There is meat, he says. There is wine. And so the girl eats the flesh of her grandmother. She drinks the blood of her grandmother. A cat, sitting by the hearth, cries out, "Slut! Slut! You are eating your mother's mother!" But the beast kills the cat with a clog thrown from the bed. This cannibalistic communion is the shocking heart of the primal layer. It is a scene that makes modern audiences recoil, but we must understand the viral DNA here. In a world of famine, where death was omnipresent, the line between life and meat was thin. This wasn't just horror, it was a grim reflection of the cycle of nature. The old are consumed to sustain the young. It is a terrifying literalization of generational succession. But the horror continues. The beast demands she come to bed. "Throw your clothes in the fire," he commands. "You won't need them anymore." Piece by piece, the girl strips. Her apron, her bodice, her skirt. With each item she asks, "Where should I put this?" And the beast replies, "Throw it in the fire. You won't be needing it again." This ritualistic stripping is the shedding of civilization. The fire consumes the tools of her humanity, her clothes, her status, her protection. She climbs into the bed naked, vulnerable, completely exposed to the wild. This is the moment of maximum tension. She lies beside the beast and begins the famous dialogue. "What big hair you have, grandmother, the better to keep me warm. What big nails you have, the better to scratch myself. What big teeth you have, the better to eat you with." But here is where the Iron Age story diverges radically from the one you know. In the version the brothers Grimm would later write, "The girl is eaten, or saved by a man. She is passive." But in this ancient layer, the girl is a survivor. She realizes, too late, what is in the bed with her. She smells the blood. She feels the fur. She does not scream. She does not faint. She thinks. She tells the wolf she needs to relieve herself. "I have to go outside," she says. The wolf objects, telling her to do it in the bed. She insists, claiming she cannot be so dirty. Reluctantly, the wolf agrees. But he ties a woolen cord to her ankle so she cannot run away. He holds the other end, a leash connecting the predator to the prey. The girl goes outside into the cold night air. She quickly unties the cord from her ankle and ties it to a plum tree in the yard. Then, she runs. She runs back to the path of pins, back through the dark woods, tearing her skin on the brambles, fleeing toward the safety of the village. Inside the cottage, the wolf calls out, "Are you done making a load?" He tugs on the rope, and the tree stands firm. He thinks she is still there. By the time he realizes the trick and leaps from the bed to pursue her, she is gone. She has crossed the river, a mythological boundary that evil often cannot cross, and reached safety. This is the primal origin. In this layer, the story is not about obedience. It is about wits. It is a trickster tale. The heroine saves herself not through purity, and certainly not through the intervention of a woodcutter or a hunter. There is no male savior in the Iron Age. There is only the girl and her own desperate intelligence. The message to the children sitting by that ancient fire was clear and brutal. The world is a hungry place. It will try to consume you. It will trick you into destroying your own family. And when you are naked and trapped in the dark with a monster, no one is coming to save you. You must save yourself. This was a story for a hard people living hard lives. It encoded the resilience required to survive in a world where the night belonged to the wolves. But as the centuries turned, and the forests of Europe began to shrink, the nature of the fear changed. The literal wolf began to fade from the collective consciousness, replaced by a threat that was far more insidious. As the story traveled from the peasant hearths to the town squares of the Middle Ages, the beast began to change. He stood up on two legs. He learned to speak more fluently, and the horror shifted from the fear of being eaten to the fear of the other. The story was about to absorb the paranoia of a society obsessed with witches, demons, and the corruption of the soul. The Iron Age survival guide was about to become a medieval nightmare. As the story traveled along trade routes and settled into the growing towns of medieval Europe, the viral DNA of the tale mutated again. We are leaving the Iron Age forests, where the threat was biological, a hungry animal, and entering the medieval mind, where the threat was spiritual and social. In the Middle Ages, the physical world was merely a stage for a cosmic war between God and the devil. The wolf didn't just disappear. He evolved. He stopped being a simple predator and became a symbol of the demonic. This is the era of the werewolf trials, a period of mass hysteria that paralleled the witch hunts but often gets overlooked. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, thousands of people in Europe, mostly men, were accused of being werewolves or lycanthropes. They weren't accused of just being wolves. They were accused of making pacts with Satan to obtain a wolf strap or a magical pelt that allowed them to transform. This cultural anxiety reshaped the story of the girl in the woods. In this layer, the wolf is no longer a beast of nature. He is a sorcerer. He is a man who has abandoned his humanity. The peasant storytellers of this era infused the tale with the specific fears of their time. The fear of the heretic, the outsider, the neighbor who isn't what he seems. The story now begins to focus less on the cannibalistic gore, though it remains, and more on the deception. In the medieval versions, the wolf doesn't just run to the grandmother's house. He engages the girl in a theological debate or a test of manners. He represents the false prophet or the tempter. Consider the trial of Peter Stump in 1589, the werewolf of Bedburg. He was a real man accused of killing and eating 14 children and 2 pregnant women. The pamphlets circulated about his crimes read like a horror story describing how he lured victims with a congenial attitude before transforming. This reality bled into the folklore. The wolf in the story became a stand-in for men like Stump. The dialogue in the bed takes on a new, terrifying subtext. When the girl asks, "What big eyes you have?" she isn't just noting a physical deformity. She is recognizing the evil eye, the mark of the supernatural. The wolf's ability to speak, to reason, to wear the grandmother's clothes, these were proofs of his demonic nature. Animals don't wear clothes. Only something that mocks humanity wears clothes. This layer also introduces a heavy dose of xenophobia. Medieval villages were insular. Anyone from the next valley over was suspicious. Anyone from the deep woods was dangerous. The wolf represents the stranger. He is the vagabond, the masterless man, the figure who exists outside the feudal order. The girl's journey in this era becomes a morality play about vigilance. The medieval church taught that the devil could appear in any form, even a trusted relative. The fact that the wolf successfully impersonates the grandmother is a warning. Do not trust your eyes. Trust your faith. Trust the community. Crucially, the ending in this layer remains grim, often drifting between the trickster escape of the Iron Age and the total tragedy that would come later. But a new element often appears here. The intervention of the community after the fact. Sometimes the villagers arrive to kill the wolf, but often too late to save the girl. This reflected the harsh justice of the time. Crime could not always be prevented, but it could be avenged with brutal public execution. The story was no longer just about survival. It was about sin. The girl's mistake wasn't just wandering off the path. It was conversing with the devil. She entertained the stranger. She listened to his lies. In the medieval worldview, curiosity was a vice. By stopping to talk to the wolf, she opened the door to evil. This version of the story served to police the boundaries of the village and the mind. It taught children and adults that the world was full of wolves in sheep's clothing. It was a lesson in spiritual paranoia. But as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and the early modern period, the story was about to be captured by the upper classes. The mud and the demons were about to be scrubbed away. The story was moving from the village square to the royal court. It was time for the wolf to put on a velvet coat. It was time for Charles Perrault to ruin everything. The mud of the medieval village dries up and cracks, replaced by the polished marble floors of Versailles. The smell of wood smoke and livestock fades, masked by heavy perfumes and powder. We have arrived in 17th century France. specifically the year 1697. This is the era of the Sun King, Louis XIV. It is a time of rigid etiquette, elaborate fashion, and dangerous court politics. And it is here that our story undergoes its most radical and damaging surgery. The surgeon is a high-ranking civil servant named Charles Perrault. Perrault is often called the father of the fairy tale, but in the context of our evolutionary timeline, he is more like a gentrifier. He took the raw, bloody, oral traditions of the peasantry stories that had been kept alive by washerwomen and wet nurses and repackaged them for the amusement of the French aristocracy. He smoothed out the rough edges, removed the cannibalism, and added moralistic framing. But in doing so, he stripped the female protagonist of her most important asset, her brain. Enter the Red Hood. It is crucial to understand that for thousands of years, the girl had no specific costume. She was just a girl. It was Perrault who dressed her in red. Why? In the visual language of the 17th century, red was a loud signal. It symbolized many things: sin, passion, non-conformity, but most importantly, it symbolized visibility. By giving her a bright red chaperon, Perrault marked her. He turned her from a survivor into a target. She is no longer blending into the woods. She is walking through them like a beacon. The wolf in this layer also gets a makeover. He is no longer the hairy, terrifying Bzoo of the Iron Age, nor the demonic sorcerer of the Middle Ages. In Perrault's text, the wolf is described with a terrifyingly human intelligence. He does not attack her on the road because there are woodcutters nearby. He is calculating. He possesses restraint. This wolf is a metaphor for the gallant, the charming, predatory man of the French court, the kind of man who lurks in the salons of Paris, well-dressed and soft-spoken, waiting to prey on the reputation of young débutantes. Perrault is not writing about the danger of the forest anymore. He is writing about the danger of the parlor. The interaction between the wolf and Red Riding Hood changes from a test of wits to a failure of etiquette. The girl stops to talk to him not because she is foolish, but because she is polite. She is a well-bred young lady, and well-bred ladies do not ignore gentlemen, even when those gentlemen have sharp teeth. She gives him directions. She engages in conversation. In the Iron Age, this was a tactical error. In Perrault's France, this is a fatal social slip. The most disturbing change, however, happens in the bedroom. Perrault keeps the famous "what big teeth you have" dialogue, but he removes the path of pins and needles, and the trickster escape. The girl gets into bed, and she is terrified. The tension builds. She asks the questions. The wolf answers. And then, nothing. There is no bathroom break. There is no clever ruse with a rope and a plum tree. There is no escape across the river. The wolf says, "The better to eat you with," and he eats her. The story ends. There is no huntsman. No grandmother jumps out of the belly. The girl dies. She is consumed by the predator, and the curtain falls. It is a bleak, nihilistic ending that shocks modern readers who are used to the Disney-fied version, but for Perrault, this death was necessary. It wasn't a tragedy. It was the entire point. Perrault even included a rhyming moral at the end of the story, just in case the aristocrats missed the subtext. Children, especially attractive, well-bred young ladies, should never talk to strangers, for if they should do so, they may well provide dinner for a wolf. I say wolf, but there are various kinds of wolves. There are also those who are charming, quiet, polite, unassuming, complacent, and sweet, who pursue young women at home and in the streets. And unfortunately, it is these gentle wolves who are the most dangerous ones of all. Do you see what happened? The story has been inverted. The Iron Age story was about female agency. It said, "You are smart enough to kill the monster." The Perrault story is about female helplessness. It says, "You are prey. If you step out of line, if you are too friendly, if you wear red, you will be destroyed." Perrault transformed a survival guide into a victim-blaming parable. The sin is no longer dealing with demons. The sin is losing one's virtue. The wolf doesn't take her life in a biological sense. He takes her honor. And in 17th century France, a woman without honor might as well be dead. This version of the story traveled across Europe in printed pamphlets, infecting the cultural consciousness. It taught girls that they were passive participants in their own lives. It taught them that the world was full of men they couldn't defeat, only avoid. It replaced the resourcefulness of the peasant with the terror of the debutante. But this harsh, cynical ending didn't sit right with everyone. As the Enlightenment faded and the Romantic era began, a new mood was sweeping across Germany. The 19th century was approaching, and with it, a desire for order, nationalism, and the sanctity of the nuclear family. The story was about to be rewritten again. The girl couldn't save herself. That was too wild, too pagan. But she couldn't just die. That was too depressing. She needed a savior. She needed a father figure. Enter the Brothers Grimm, and the era of the Victorian rescue. The wolf was about to meet the only thing more dangerous than a trickster girl, the crushing weight of 19th century patriarchy. The year is 1812. The Napoleonic Wars are tearing across Europe, reshaping borders and shattering old allegiances. In the quiet university town of Kassel, two brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, are fighting a different kind of war. Their weapon is ink. Their goal is to construct a unified German identity from the fragments of folklore. When the Grimms encountered the story of Little Red Riding Hood, titled Rotkäppchen, in their collection, they faced a problem. The Iron Age version was too crude and sexual. The Perrault version was too French, too cynical, and far too hopeless. The emerging German middle class, the Bürgertum, demanded stories that reinforced moral order. They needed tales where authority was respected, where chaos was contained, and where good eventually triumphed over evil. And so, they performed the final great surgery on the text. They introduced the figure that would define the modern understanding of the tale, the huntsman. This addition changed the entire gravitational pull of the narrative. In the Iron Age, the girl saved herself. In the French court, she was destroyed. But in the Victorian-era nursery, she is saved by the intervention of the state. The huntsman is not a relative. He is a uniformed officer, a figure of the law, patrolling the borders of the wild. He represents the benevolent, masculine authority that keeps the chaos of nature at bay. The scene plays out with a heavy, deliberate pacing. The wolf, having devoured both the grandmother and the girl, does not flee. He falls asleep in the bed and begins to snore. The snoring is loud, so loud it shakes the cottage. This is the noise of a gluttonous aristocracy, of a disruptive force that has violated the sanctity of the German home. The huntsman hears this noise and investigates. He enters the cottage and sees the wolf. He raises his musket, a phallic instrument of modern violence, but then he pauses. He realizes the victims might still be alive. He lowers the gun and picks up a pair of scissors. This moment is profound. It is a surgical intervention. The huntsman performs a crude caesarean section on the sleeping beast. Snip, snip, snip. The belly is opened. Out pops Little Red Cap, crying, "Oh, how frightened I was. It was so dark inside the wolf." This is the Victorian rescue. The girl is reborn, but not through her own wits. She is birthed from the belly of the beast by the hands of a father figure. She emerges not as a woman who has learned a hard lesson, but as a frightened child who promises never to disobey again. The first words she speaks are an admission of fear. The last words she thinks in the story are, "As long as I live, I will never leave the path by myself to run into the wood, when my mother has forbidden it." The transformation is complete. The trickster heroine of the Iron Age has become the obedient daughter of the Industrial Age. Her survival is now conditional on her obedience to parental and state authority. But the Grimms weren't finished. They added a coda to the death of the wolf that reflects the vindictive morality of the 19th century. They don't just kill the wolf, they punish him. Red Riding Hood fetches great stones from the yard. They fill the sleeping wolf's belly with these heavy rocks and sew him back up. When the wolf wakes and tries to run, the weight of the stones drags him down. He collapses and dies of exhaustion, or in some versions, falls into a well and drowns. This imagery, stones in the belly, is symbolic of the heavy, crushing nature of sin. The wolf is literally weighed down by his gluttony. It is a stark lesson for children. Wickedness carries a physical weight. It drags you down. In this layer, the story becomes a celebration of the nuclear family and the sanctity of the home. The grandmother, the past, the girl, the future, and the huntsman, the protector, sit down together to eat the cake and drink the wine. Order is restored. The chaotic, sexual, hungry energy of the wolf has been neutralized by the gun and the scissors. But there is a subtle, disturbing undertone to this rescue. By removing the girl's agency, the Victorian layer teaches a dangerous lesson: learned helplessness. It suggests that when you are in trouble, you should wait. Wait for the police. Wait for the father. Wait for the hero. It erased the ancient knowledge that sometimes the hero never comes. The Grimms successfully domesticated the nightmare. They took a story about the terrifying, unpredictable nature of reality and turned it into a Sunday school lesson about doing what you're told. They built a fence around the forest. For over a century, this version reigned supreme. It was printed in millions of books, painted in nursery murals, and adapted into early cartoons. It became the definitive version. Most people today don't even know the other layers exist, but history never truly stops. As the 20th century dawned, the rigid structures of the Victorian world began to crack. 2 world wars shattered the illusion of the benevolent state, and in the quiet consulting rooms of Vienna and Zurich, doctors began to listen to the dreams of their patients. They began to realize that the wolf wasn't just an animal, and he wasn't just a man. He was a part of us. The story was about to enter the human mind. The final layer, the psychological layer, was about to be written, where the forest is no longer a place on a map, but the dark, tangled subconscious of the human being. As the 20th century dawned, the fences the Grimms built around the forest began to rot. The horrors of 2 world wars and the rise of psychoanalysis shattered the Victorian illusion of order. We realized that the most dangerous things weren't hiding in the woods. They were hiding in our own minds. This is the final layer, the psychological mirror. When Freud and Jung looked at Little Red Riding Hood, they didn't see a moral lesson. They saw a roadmap of the human psyche. The red hood wasn't just a garment. It was the color of blood, of menstruation, of the violent transition from childhood to womanhood. The wolf wasn't a stranger. He was the id, our deepest, darkest desires, our aggression, our hunger. And the huntsman was the superego, the crushing weight of social rules that keep us in check. In this modern reading, the story isn't about avoiding the wolf. It's about the inevitable collision between our civilized selves and our wild nature. We realized that by sowing stones into the wolf's belly, we were just repressing our own shadows, sinking them into the deep wells of our subconscious, where they would only fester. That is why, in the last 50 years, the story has mutated once again. Look at modern retellings from Angela Carter's The Company of Wolves to the paranormal romances of today. The script has flipped. The girl stops screaming. She stops waiting for the huntsman. In many of these modern versions, she drops the knife. She approaches the wolf. She joins him. We have come full circle, but with a twist. We aren't returning to the Iron Age fear of the beast. We are embracing the Iron Age resilience. We have stopped looking for a savior and started looking for integration. We realize that to survive the dark forest of the modern world, you cannot just be the innocent girl, and you cannot just rely on the huntsman. You have to find the wolf inside yourself. This is why Little Red Riding Hood is immortal. When you read it today, you aren't reading a single story. You are holding a 3,000-year-old artifact composed of sedimentary layers. You are seeing the literal hunger of the Iron Age peasant, the spiritual paranoia of the medieval villager, the sexual cynicism of the French court, the rigid morality of the Victorian family, and the psychological complexity of the modern self. All of them are true. All of them are happening at once. The story persists because the fear persists. The woods have changed. They are now city streets, or online spaces, or the dark corners of our own minds. But the warning remains the same. There is a path. There is a choice. And there is always, always something hungry waiting in the shadows. The only question left is, when you meet the wolf, will you run? Will you scream for help? Or will you recognize him? If you want to help us excavate more of these hidden histories and uncover the dark origins of the stories you thought you knew, please click that subscribe button. We have many more layers to peel back, and we don't want you to wander into the woods alone. Thanks for watching.